Welcome to the end. This is the third and final chapter of our series, What If Harry Potter Never Went to Hogwarts? If you've missed the first two parts of this journey, hit the links on the screen right now, or look in the description. You need to see how a boy from a cupboard became the ghost of Privet Drive before you see how he becomes a legend. For everyone else, let's finish this. Weeks after the fall of Sirius, Harry stands in the skeletal remains of an industrial site on the Thames, his mind finally piecing together the grim truths Dumbledore had kept in the shadows. He reflects on the headmaster's explanation of how Voldemort truly returned, merging a soul fragment from the forest of Albania with the piece hidden in a diary, a dark union that claims Ginny Weasley's life. The long secretive missions Lydia and Dumbledore had been conducting finally make sense. They were never just scouting the city, they were hunting and destroying the Dark Lord's Horcruxes. The tide in Harry's blood has settled into a cold, predatory stillness that leaves him unrecognisable to the Order back in the bunker. They are no longer hiding, they are looking for the next piece of a broken soul. A sharp crack of apparition echoes through the rusted iron beams, and Harry watches as Bellatrix Lestrange emerges from the shadows near the river's edge. He feels no surge of fear, only a clinical intent as he gestures for Lupin to move in, signalling that their mark has finally arrived. Lupin grips Harry's shoulder, his voice a low, urgent whisper, warning him that Bellatrix is as lethally skilled as she is unhinged. Harry doesn't wait for the end of the sentence. He shakes off the hand and lunges from the cover of the rusted beams, a bolt of red light erupting from his holly wand. Bellatrix twists with a predator's grace, swatting the spell aside with a flick of her wrist before firing a silent curse that catches Lupin in the chest, sending him spinning away into the darkness. She turns her manic gaze on Harry, her wand tip glowing with a sickly white heat, as she unleashes a barrage of curses intended to break the ghost of Privet Drive. Instead of shielding, Harry opens his palm and allows the tide in his blood to pull the spells into himself, feeling the stolen magic swell until his skin feels tight with the pressure. He releases a concentrated pulse of that energy, a violet shockwave that slams Bellatrix backward into the brickwork, with enough force to crack the wall. Lupin scrambles to his feet and disarms the dazed witch before she can recover, but she simply sits against the wall with a bloody, mad smile on her face. When Harry demands to know where the Dark Lord keeps his most prized possessions, she asks with a mock sweetness how her cousin is doing, before feigning a gasp of realization and laughing that Sirius is already dead. Harry doesn't shout, he simply points his wand at her heart and whispers the Cruciatus curse, watching as the woman who mocked his godfather's death finally learns the meaning of pain. The air in the warehouse screams with a raw electrical crackle of the curse until Lupin lunges forward, grabbing Harry's arm to break the connection. He tells Harry that this isn't the path of a hero, and that Sirius would never have approved of such a soul-crushing display of darkness. Harry's head snaps around, his eyes glowing with a cold, terrifying intensity, as he shoves Lupin back with a burst of wordless magic. He tells the man he doesn't need a morality check from a werewolf, and that the old ways of the Order are exactly what got Sirius killed. Lupin stares at Harry for a long moment, his face a mask of profound disappointment and sorrow, before he turns and disappears into the shadows of the Thames. Left alone with his prey, Harry turns back to Bellatrix, the tide in his blood finally overflowing into his hand. The torture continues in the absolute silence of the docks, until Bellatrix's mind finally fractures under the weight of the pain. Through her gasping sobs, she reveals that the Dark Lord's most prized possession, a golden cup, is hidden deep within the high-security vaults of Gringotts Bank. Harry returns to the reinforced walls of the bunker, dragging a broken, muttering Bellatrix Lestrange through the dim corridors before throwing her into a cold, iron-barred cell. The silence of the underground is heavy with the weight of his actions, and the tide in his blood still thrums with a restless, dark energy. Albus Dumbledore finds him there, watching the boy with a look that is no longer clinical, but deeply weary. The old man finally breaks the silence, admitting that he has kept his distance because of the darkness he sensed growing within Harry. A power so volatile that Dumbledore himself had not yet decided if Harry was destined to save the world or be the one to finally destroy it. Dumbledore steps closer, his voice softening as he addresses the ghosts of Harry's childhood. He confesses that the decision to leave him at St. Jude's was born of a desperate need to keep him hidden from the countless enemies who would have hunted him had he stayed by Dumbledore's side. He admits he failed the boy, offering a quiet apology for the years of isolation and hunger that forged Harry into the weapon he has become. Dumbledore reaches into his robes and pulls out a shimmering silvery fabric, telling Harry that it rightly belongs to him, as it was once the property of his father. As Harry's fingers brush the fabric, he feels the violent tide in his blood, the restless storm of magic that has fueled his rage for weeks, suddenly begin to recede. He looks at the invisibility cloak, and for the first time he feels a visceral connection to the parents he never knew, a sense of belonging that cuts through the fog of his resentment. The clarity is immediate. The clinical wall between him and the headmaster crumbles, replaced by a fragile but real sense of shared purpose. Harry looks at the old man, his mind steady and his focus sharp, and simply says, "Thank you." Harry, Lydia and Dumbledore gather around a tactical map in the flickering light of the bunker's nerve centre, joined by a girl with a sharp, observant eyes, whom Lydia introduces as Hermione Granger. Lydia explains that Hermione is the leading expert on the Dark Lord's history, the mind responsible for tracking his previous soul shards to a cursed ring, a locket, and a lost diadem. Hermione notes she had long suspected Voldemort was using the heirlooms of the Hogwarts founders to anchor his soul. But until Harry broke Bellatrix, the location of Hufflepuff's cup had remained a frustrating mystery. The atmosphere in the room grows heavy as the reality of their target sets in. Lydia admits that while they finally know where the cup is hidden, she has no idea how they can possibly breach the high-security vaults of Gringotts without alerting the entire ministry. She looks to the others, her face etched with the silent admission that the bank is a fortress the Resistance has never dared to touch. The silence is broken by Hermione, who leans over a set of stolen blueprints and calmly states that she has already devised a plan to get them through the front doors. Hermione details the strategy, explaining that they will use a single dose of Polyjuice potion brewed from a lock of hair taken from the broken woman in the cell below. With Bellatrix's wand and Harry hidden beneath the silvery folds of his father's cloak, they have a way past the goblins. Dumbledore observes that since they only have the one prisoner to mimic, only one of them can serve as the decoy. Harry immediately turns to Lydia, his voice sharp and protective, telling her she isn't doing this. He won't risk her in the heart of the enemy's bank. As the realization of who is left sinks in, all eyes slowly turn toward the headmaster. Dumbledore draws himself up to his full, imposing height, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and wounded pride, as he dismisses the suggestion as utterly ridiculous and far beneath the dignity of a wizard of his standing. Lydia doesn't flinch. She looks the greatest wizard of the age in the eye and tells him to either find a better plan or start drinking the potion. The scene shifts abruptly to the dim light of the bunker's staging area. Standing in Dumbledore's embroidered, floor-length robes is Bellatrix Lestrange. Her, or rather his, expression is one of profound, wide-eyed horror, flicking his wand with a sharp, reluctant motion. His embroidered robes shiver and darken, lengthening and narrowing until they become the tattered, elegant black dress of the Dark Lord's lieutenant. The headmaster looks down at his new form with a scowl, making it understood that if any record of this humiliation ever reaches the history books, he will personally ensure the Hogwarts library is burned to the ground. Harry watches, barely able to hide his shock, as Dumbledore, still moving with his usual dignified grace, adjusts his skirts and prepares for the heist. Harry and the disguised Dumbledore arrive at the white stone walls of Gringotts, the air heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient magic. Harry is a silent shadow, invisible beneath the silvery folds of the cloak his father once wore. They move through the bank with a chilling synchronized efficiency, descending into the deep light-drinking caverns buried beneath the city streets. Inside the vaults, they retrieve the golden cup, but the victory is short-lived as the trap is sprung in the tunnels outside. A group of Death Eaters blocks their exit, their mask reflecting the dim torchlight. Dumbledore drops his disguise in a swirl of dark fabric and holds the hallway with a series of blinding explosive spells that shake the very foundations of the bank. Amidst the chaos, Harry feels a sharp, agonizing coldness erupt in his scar, alerting Dumbledore that the Dark Lord is close. He can feel Voldemort's fury vibrating through the stone, a rhythmic, terrifying pressure that signals their escape has been cut off. Realizing they are trapped between an army and the abyss, Dumbledore uses a massive final burst of magic to slam and seal the vault door, locking them both inside a chamber of gold and shifting shadows. In the sudden ringing silence of the tomb, Dumbledore looks at Harry with an expression of calm, terrifying certainty. He tells Harry he has finally made his decision. Harry is confused, his mind racing to find the meaning behind a choice he doesn't understand. Suddenly, Dumbledore whips his wand with a sharp, violent motion, sending a spell toward Harry that forces the boy to fire a countercurse in a desperate split-second reflex. Their spells meet in the center of the vault, a clash of red and white light that illuminates the piles of gold in a rhythmic, blinding pulse. Harry feels the tide in his blood rise to a level he has never known, a restless heat that threatens to swallow the room. He wonders if the headmaster has been compromised by an Imperio curse, but as the power vibrates through his arm, a surge of arrogance takes hold, a chance to finally best the strongest wizard of their age. The familiar tide wells up inside him, craving to consume Dumbledore's magic and turn it back on the old man. But Harry has a sudden grounding thought. He wants to win this with his own craft, to prove he is more than just a weapon. He pushes with everything he has, and for a fleeting moment, he feels as though he is actually winning. Then Dumbledore's magic becomes overwhelming, a raw and ancient power that pushes Harry back with the weight of centuries. The tide inside Harry begins to rage, whispering that he will lose if he does not let it take control. Just as Harry reaches the point of collapse, Dumbledore looks at him and offers a small, knowing wink. The headmaster suddenly lets go, his defense vanishing as if it were never there. Harry's spell hits him with the force of a tidal wave, and Dumbledore's wand, a long, gnarled piece of wood, is torn from his hand. It flies through the air, landing perfectly in Harry's grip as the silence of the vault returns. Harry stands in the ringing silence of the vault, his fingers curled around the ancient gnarled wood of Dumbledore's wand. He stares at the headmaster, his mind reeling from the sudden violence and the even more sudden surrender. Dumbledore offers no complex explanation, simply stating that it was a test. Harry gestures to the chaos erupting outside the sealed door, noting that this is a hell of a time for a performance, and moves to return the wand. Dumbledore refuses the gesture, his hand remaining firm as he tells Harry to keep the wand and the cup. He instructs the boy to pull the silvery folds of the invisibility cloak over himself and escape through the confusion while he provides the distraction. When Harry refuses to leave him behind, Dumbledore offers a calm assurance that he will follow as soon as the way is clear. The headmaster reaches into his robes and pulls out the curved blackened wand that belonged to Bellatrix Lestrange. He grips the cruel instrument with a grim determination, the weapon of torture looking utterly alien in the hands of a man who spent a lifetime seeking the light. Dumbledore pauses, his voice dropping to a whisper as he tells Harry that whatever happens, help will always be given at Hogwarts to those who ask for it. Harry looks at him with a flash of genuine confusion. The school, he thinks. What's that got to do with anything? But before he can question the ex-headmaster's words, Dumbledore turns toward the heavy iron door. With a sharp, decisive motion, Dumbledore throws open the vault, stepping out into a blaze of glory and the waiting army. Harry, hidden beneath the cloak, has no choice but to move. The weight of the cup and the gnarled wand, the only solid things in a world that is suddenly falling apart. Dumbledore becomes a whirlwind of silver and gold light, the blackened wand of Bellatrix Lestrange moving with a terrifying, jagged speed that seems to mock its own cruel history. He holds back dozens of curses at a time, his movements a blur as he deflects spells into the stone floor and sends roaring waves of fire back at the encroaching Death Eaters. Harry watches from beneath the cloak in absolute awe, the realization hitting him that Dumbledore is an extraordinary wizard, truly the greatest of their age. Amidst the chaos, Harry feels a sinking weight in his chest, a certainty that no matter how hard he trains, he will never be a legend like Albus Dumbledore. But Dumbledore is only one man, and the blackened wand he carries is an unwilling tool in his hand. As he turns to shield himself from a volley of curses, Voldemort seizes the momentary opening with a predator's precision. The Dark Lord's wand slashes through the air, and a bolt of brilliant, sickening, vibrant green light streaks across the hall. It hits Dumbledore squarely in the chest. The roar of the battle seems to vanish, replaced by a suffocating absolute silence. Harry watches as the man who was his protector and his only link to a world of rules falls backward, his body hitting the marble floor with a dull, final thud. The very light in the room seems to dim, as if the world itself is mourning the stillness in Dumbledore's eyes. Harry stumbles through the dark, damp service tunnels of the underground, drenched from the London rain and gasping for air. He feels like a ghost haunting his own life, clutching the cold gold of Hufflepuff's cup in one hand and the ancient gnarled weight of Dumbledore's wand in the other. The wand feels like lead, a heavy constant reminder of the price paid to retrieve it. Lydia stands in the centre of the main junction, her silhouette sharp against the flickering emergency lights of the station. When she hears Harry's footsteps, she doesn't call out, she simply waits, her hands trembling as she searches the shadows behind him for the tall, silver-bearded man who was supposed to be leading the way. When she sees only Harry, her gaze falls to the objects in his hands, and the silence that follows becomes suffocating. Lydia doesn't need to ask. The weight of the wand and the cup tells the story of the sacrifice, and her expression shifts from terror to a deep, hollow grief. Harry is consumed by a crushing wave of shame, feeling like a coward for slipping out the back door while the greatest wizard of all time stood alone against an army. He thinks of Dumbledore's final command to save the cup and himself, but his voice is nothing more than a broken whisper, as he confesses to Lydia that he simply ran. Lydia doesn't judge him, she simply pulls him into her embrace. Harry buries his face against her shoulder and cries, the sound echoing off the cold tiles of the station, realizing that the hand that had pulled the strings of his life for 16 years was finally gone, and he was no longer a pawn on a board of half-truths, but the player left to make the final move. Harry pulls back from the comfort of Lydia's embrace, his eyes fixed on the golden cup resting on the cold, damp floor of the junction. He raises the gnarled ancient wand Dumbledore gave him and tries to force the tide in his blood into the wood, desperate to feel the roar of magic the headmaster had commanded. But the wand remains a dead weight. It feels like a piece of lead, cold and unresponsive to his touch. The silence of the wood is deafening, a physical manifestation of his own guilt. It is as if the wand knows he is a thief who fled while its true master fell. With a snarl of frustration, Harry thrusts the Elder Wand into his belt and draws his own Holly Wand. The moment his fingers wrap around the familiar grip, the connection is instantaneous and violent. The tide doesn't just hum, it surges with a predatory heat, fueled by his grief and the raw, jagged edges of his rage. He whispers the incantation for fiend fire, but instead of the usual uncontrollable inferno that consumes everything in its path, the magic manifests as a singular, white-hot ribbon of living flame. It isn't a wild beast, it's a surgical blade. With a flick of his wrist, Harry commands the fire to coil around the golden cup. The heat is so intense it turns the air to a shimmering haze, yet the flames never stray an inch toward the surrounding tunnel walls. As the last of the white-hot flames flicker out, the silence in the tunnel is shattered by a jagged spike of cold pain that erupts behind Harry's scar. He is dragged violently into the Dark Lord's fracturing mind, leaving the damp London underground behind. He finds himself in a chamber of cold stone where Voldemort stands, his red eyes wide with a rare, trembling fear as he realizes another of his anchors has been dismantled. The Dark Lord is no longer a figure of cold command, but a man paralyzed by the knowledge of his own vulnerability. He stands over the massive undulating coils of Nagini, who is now encased in a shimmering golden cage of protective enchantments. Harry jolts back into his own body, his boots slipping on the wet tiles as he gasps for air. Lydia is there instantly, her hand steadying his shoulders, but he pulls away with a newfound lethal clarity. He meets her gaze and silently conveys the urgency of the moment, indicating with a sharp, decisive gesture that the time for mourning has passed. He makes it clear that the council must be summoned, Hermione, the Order, and everyone left who can carry a wand. The atmosphere in the war room is thick with the heavy, unspoken grief for Albus Dumbledore. Flickering emergency lights cast long, jagged shadows across the tactical maps as the remaining leaders of the Resistance gather in the cramped space. Mad-Eye Moody stands in the corner, his magical eye whirling with restless paranoia, while McGonagall and Lupin stand side by side, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a decade of losing ground. Harry stands at the head of the table, the knurled Elder Wand a cold, silent weight in his belt. Breaking the heavy silence, Harry speaks with a newfound clarity, telling the assembled council that the snake is the final anchor, the last piece of the Dark Lord's soul that remains, stating they must find a way to draw the monster out from behind his defences and force him into the open for the final strike. As the weight of the task settles over the room, Hermione steps forward into the light, her fingers tracing the ancient jagged silhouette of Hogwarts on the map. She presents her findings with a clinical intensity, drawing from years of studying the Dark Lord's obsession with his own history. She indicates that Voldemort is a man rooted in twisted sentimentality for his past. The castle isn't just a fortress to him, but the only place he ever truly considered home. By launching a full-scale assault on the heart of his pride, they won't just be attacking a building, they will be forcing the monster to defend his sanctuary. Hermione's logic is cold and undeniable. If they strike Hogwarts with everything the Resistance has left, Voldemort will have no choice but to descend with his entire army, bringing the snake within reach for the final kill. The bunker is a hive of controlled chaos as the strike team prepares for the journey to Hogsmeade. Harry, Lydia, Ron and Hermione check their gear in the flickering light, the air thick with the metallic scent of sharpened blades and charged wands. They are the vanguard, sent ahead to coordinate with McGonagall's contact in the village, while the rest of the Resistance mobilises for the march on Hogwarts. Before Harry can reach the exit, Lupin intercepts him, his hand catching Harry's shoulder with a firm, grounding pressure. He pulls Harry into the shadows of a rusted support beam, his expression a mixture of profound sorrow and quiet, resilient strength. Lupin imparts a final warning, urging Harry not to let the battle, or the tide in his blood, wash away the boy he was before the bunker, the boy his parents would have known. He reaches into his worn jacket and produces a small, weathered photograph he found among Sirius's personal effects. Harry takes the photo, his fingers trembling slightly as he looks at the moving images of James and Lily Potter. They are laughing, waving at the camera with a joy that seems impossible in the world Harry now inhabits. Lupin conveys the depth of his pride, assuring Harry that his parents and Sirius would be staggered by the man he has become. He makes it clear that despite the shadows and the hard choices, he is proud to have stood beside Harry. The silence between them is heavy with the memory of their earlier confrontation. Harry offers a wordless, profound apology for his cruel words in the Thames warehouse, making it clear that he truly never saw Lupin anything less than a mentor and a friend, regardless of his condition. Lupin offers a weary, knowing smile, indicating that he had already forgiven him for his desperation. They share a brief, powerful embrace, a final bridge over the rift between them, before Harry turns away, with the photo tucked safely against his heart. Harry steps into the emerald heat of the Flu network. One by one, the team vanishes into the spinning green flames, leaving the London Underground behind for the cold, snow-dusted streets of Hogsmeade. The green flames of the Flu network spit Harry out into the drafty, salt-stained interior of the Hog's Head Inn. The air here is thick with the smell of sour ale and goat, a sharp contrast to the damp metallic tang of the London Underground. Aberforth Dumbledore stands behind the bar, his eyes strikingly similar to his brother's, but lacking the twinkle, fixed on the small group. With a curt, jagged motion of his head, he indicates a door at the back of the room, signalling that a guest is already waiting. Harry leaves Lydia, Ron and Hermione with Aberforth, and enters the back room alone. Standing in the centre of the dimly lit space is a man with greasy, shoulder-length black hair, and skin the colour of parched bone. Severus Snape doesn't move as Harry enters. He simply watches with a cold, predatory stillness. The sneer that curls his lip is instantaneous, a reflex born of decades of bitterness, as he notes that Harry is the walking image of his father. But then the mask slips for a fraction of a second. His voice drops into a haunting, guttural softness as he acknowledges that Harry has his mother's eyes. Snape reveals his position as the current headmaster of Hogwarts, a title that feels like a heavy, ill-fitting shroud. He makes it clear that he has the power to bypass the castle's heightened defences and get Harry inside. But he pauses, his dark eyes boring into Harry's with a mixture of suspicion and a deep-buried grief. He admits that Albus Dumbledore died, unsure if Harry could truly be trusted to finish what was started. And now, with the old man gone, the question remains unanswered. Snape challenges Harry's notorious arrogance, noting that it is still a matter of debate whether Harry is the world's saviour or its eventual destroyer. Harry stands his ground, the weight of the Elder Wand in his belt and the memory of Dumbledore's final fall vivid in his mind. He thinks back to the vault, searching for the one truth the headmaster left with him. A sudden piercing clarity hits him. He meets Snape's gaze and repeats the final riddle Dumbledore whispered before the iron doors opened. That help will always be given at Hogwarts to those who ask for it. The silence that follows is absolute. Snape stares at Harry for a long, agonising moment, the words acting as a key to a lock Harry hadn't realised was there. The tension in Snape's shoulders doesn't vanish, but it shifts, yielding to the reality of their shared burden. He simply asks what Harry needs to begin. The castle of Hogwarts stands as a jagged crown against the Scottish Highlands, no longer a school, but a fortress of the last resort. With Snape's assistance, the ancient defences have been woven into a lethal web, and the resistance waits in a heavy, suffocating silence. A terrified hum vibrates through the stone floors, the collective heartbeat of hundreds of fighters holding their breath in the dark. Lydia moves with a quiet, practiced efficiency, guiding the squibs and the youngest refugees into the safety of the Room of Requirement. She secures the entrance with a lingering look toward the Great Hall, her face a mask of grim resolve as she locks away the people her and Dumbledore have fought so hard to protect. Near the heavy oak doors of the entrance, Harry finds Ron. Their eyes meet across the sea of raised wands, and they share a singular sharp nod, a silent acknowledgement of the long road from the London tunnels to this final stand. The silence is shattered by a voice that isn't heard so much as felt, a cold and high-pitched vibration that seems to emanate from the very air itself. Voldemort's ultimatum rolls over the battlements like a physical weight, promising that every life within the walls will be spared if Harry Potter is delivered to him by midnight. The Dark Lord speaks of mercy as if it were a currency, his tone dripping with a mocking, serpentine grace. The castle does not answer, not a single footstep falters, not a single voice calls out. The defiance is found in the absolute ringing stillness of the stone. When the deadline passes, the world outside the windows disappears into a chaotic bloom of light. The assault begins not with a shout, but with the sky falling. A barrage of dark curses rain down upon the castle's shimmering blue protective dome, the impact sending tremors deep into the foundations. The war has finally come to the front door, and as the first cracks appear in the magical shield, the street mage feels the tide in his blood rise to meet the coming storm. The shimmering blue dome over Hogwarts doesn't simply fade, it shatters like a million shards of falling glass. The first wave of the assault is a physical weight, a concussive blast that blows the heavy oak doors of the Great Hall off their hinges. For a heartbeat there is a vacuum of sound, and then the screaming begins, not from the defenders, but from the spells themselves as they tear through the ancient air. The courtyard becomes a killing floor in seconds. The Death Eaters flood through the breach, their silver masks reflecting the jagged flashes of green and red light. They aren't alone. Giants loom in the periphery, their massive clubs swinging with a slow, tectonic force that brings battlements crashing down in the stone below. High above the carnage, McGonagall stands on a stone balcony, her face a mask of ancient, focused fury. With a sharp, rhythmic motion of her wand, she brings the very bones of the castle to life. The stone knights and the heavy statues leap from their plinths, their granite limbs grinding with a tectonic roar as they charge into the fray. They move with a heavy, unstoppable grace, their swords clashing against the dark magic of the invaders with a hollow ring that echoes through the courtyard, providing a wall of living rocks against the silver-masked tide. From the high ramparts, Mad-Eye Moody orchestrates a symphony of defensive fire. His magical eye spins in a frantic blue blur, tracking every shadow and movement through the thick, acrid smoke. His wand spits a constant stream of jagged blue light, picking off targets with a hunter's speed. Besides him, the seasoned members of the Order follow his lead, their spells forming a secondary layer of protection that prevents the first wave of Death Eaters from completely overwhelming the inner gates. Despite the Resistance's desperate bravery, the sheer weight of Voldemort's army begins to crush the courtyard. The Giants, emboldened by the Ministry's dark reinforcements, swing their massive clubs through stone and bone alike, while silver-masked Death Eaters flood the breaches in an endless, suffocating tide. Harry deflects a curse with a jagged flick of his wand. his eyes catching a flash of movement on the high battlements. Mad-Eye Moody falls, his body a broken silhouette against the fire-red sky as he crashes into the rubble of the courtyard below. The air is thick with the metallic tang of blood and the guttural snarls of werewolf packs. Harry turns, his heart freezing as he sees a young student being mauled in the shadows of a collapsed archway. The tide in his blood doesn't just rise, it boils. A predatory heat that demands an end to the restraint he has practiced for so long. As he stumbles across the uneven stone, his boot catches on a familiar, worn jacket. He looks down and sees Lupin lying among the debris, his eyes vacant and his hand still reaching for a wand that has finally gone silent. In that moment, the street mage vanishes, replaced by something ancient and catastrophic. Harry stops running. He walks into the very centre of the killing floor, his holly wand held low as he lets the tide wash over his consciousness. He stops deflecting spells. He begins to breathe them in. The air around him ripples as he draws the kinetic energy of every curse fired his way into the hollow of his chest, the dark pressure building until his vision swims with a violent violet light. The power becomes a deafening roar in his mind, drowning out the screams and the explosions until he can no longer distinguish friend from foe. His instinct screams for release. He pivots, his wand levelled at a pair of figures through the smoke, a raw magic already sparking at the tip of his wand, only for a frantic familiar shout to pierce the haze. He catches a glimpse of Ron and Hermione huddled behind a fallen pillar, and with a Herculean effort that feels like tearing his own muscles, he siphons the spell away. He pivots with a guttural roar, unleashing the built-up agony toward a massive flanks of Death Eaters and giants. The force is cataclysmic, a shockwave of pure, unfiltered magic that doesn't just throw the attackers back, but levels the remaining statues and clears the courtyard in a single concussive pulse. As the dust begins to settle and the ringing in the air fades to a low hum, a cold, heavy silence descends. The Death Eaters parts like a dark curtain, and Voldemort steps into the clearing. He moves with a slow, serpentine grace, his red eyes fixed on Harry with a look of clinical fascination. Behind him, the massive shimmering coils of Nagini slide over the scorched marble, the final anchor and the final target within Harry's reach. Without a word, Voldemort slashes his wand through the air. A bolt of brilliant, sickening green light, the killing curse, streaks towards Harry. Harry has no time to dodge. He opens himself up and absorbs the curse. The sensation is unlike anything he has ever felt. It isn't just power, it is an absolute godlike clarity. The tide in his blood expands until it feels as though his veins are carrying the weight of a collapsing star. He realizes with a cold and terrifying certainty that he could end everything in a single heartbeat. He looks out at the battlefield and no longer sees allies or enemies. He sees insects, small and fragile, waiting to be crushed. His eyes lock onto Nagini. The shimmering golden cage surrounding her looks like thin glass. Look how easy it is, the tide whispers in his mind. A seductive, oily voice that promises the end of all fear. Harry releases the tiniest molecule of the stored power, a mere flick of thought, and the snake simply evaporates into a fine black mist. The final Horcrux is erased from existence with the effort of a casual breath. But the darkness in his blood isn't satisfied. It surges higher, showing him a vision of a world scrubbed clean by his own hand. He could turn his wand on the Death Eaters and turn them to ash. He could turn it on the survivors, on Ron, on Hermione, on the Order, and erase the possibility of ever being betrayed or controlled again. He and Lydia could stand atop the ruins of Hogwarts, untouched and eternal, building a world where no one would ever have to die in a damp tunnel or fall from a battlement again. The street mage would finally be the master of the world that had tried to bury him. Just as the darkness prepares to pull the trigger on his humanity, a memory of a calm, terrifyingly certain face flickers in his mind. He feels the weight of the gnarled wand in his belt and remembers the silence of the vault. Dumbledore's presence echoes through the roar of the tide, a reminder that the old man had looked at Harry's violent potential and made his choice to trust the boy behind the power. Dumbledore had made his decision, and now it was time for Harry to make his. Harry reaches inward, but the tide is no longer a tool. It is a monster that has taken root in his soul. It fights back with a predatory scream, flooding his senses and threatening to drown his consciousness entirely. Harry searches deep within the architecture of his own magic, tracing the fever back to its heart. He finds the source, an endless roaring waterfall of dark energy that has fueled him since the day his parents died. With a mental roar of defiance, Harry turns every ounce of the Killing Curse's energy back onto that source. He strikes the tide at its root, intending to shatter the very thing that makes him special. The internal explosion is cataclysmic. Harry is flung back into his own physical body, his mind a void of white noise as he crashes onto the scorched marble. Across the clearing, Voldemort falls to one knee, touching his chest with a skeletal hand. A soundless scream escapes his lipless mouth as the fragment of his soul that lived inside Harry is violently torn away and destroyed. Harry gasps for air, his lungs burning, but it is the silence in his veins that truly terrifies him. The roaring waterfall of the tide has been reduced to a dry, silent riverbed. He feels small, brittle, and utterly human. Voldemort recovers first, staggering to his feet with a face etched in primal shaking rage. He sees Harry vulnerable and lashes out with a jagged binding curse. Harry reaches out to catch the light, prepared to breathe the magic into his blood as he has done 1,000 times before, but the power is gone. The spell slams into his chest, locking his limbs instantly. He is frozen into a rigid statue, his holy wand pinned uselessly against his thigh. Voldemort stalks across the scorched marble, a cold cackle escaping his throat as he pries the wand from Harry's paralysed fingers and snaps the wood in two. He tosses the splintered remains into the dirt, leaving Harry with nothing. Harry looks down at the broken wood, his mind racing through the fragments of his life. The orphan, the boy wonder, and the chosen one who just lost the only power he ever knew. But in the hollow silence of his mind, he pulls himself back to the cold, dark quiet of the abandoned tube station. He remembers the flickering candlelight and the moment he first dug deep into his chest to find a spark of energy. He remembers the copper coin vanishing from his left hand and appearing in his right. For years he believed that the tide was the source of everything, but in this moment of absolute stillness, the truth hits him. The tide was just a current he rode. The act of moving the coin, the prestige, that was him. That was his own magic, independent of the darkness he just destroyed. He doesn't try to move his frozen arms. He doesn't reach for the wand. Instead, he focuses on the gnarled ancient weight of the Elder Wand tucked into his belt, with the same singular intent he used for that first copper coin. He doesn't use the tide, he uses the Boy Wonder's own spark. In a blink, the Elder Wand simply vanishes from his belt and appears in his locked hand. The ancient wood hums with a violent, instantaneous recognition. It sings in his grip, acknowledging the master who finally found his own light. The binding curse shatters like glass. Harry moves with a blur of motion, swinging the wand upward just as Voldemort fires a final killing blast. The two spells collide in a blinding pillar of gold and white light. Harry doesn't look for a tide to carry him, he pours his own ironclad will into the wand, forcing his magic forward with a restless, crushing weight. He overpowers the Dark Lord by sheer force of spirit, his light drowning out Voldemort's malice. The light consumes the Dark Lord entirely. He doesn't fall, he simply begins to fray at the edges, his body turning to fine grey ash that is swept away by the wind. In seconds, the centre of the courtyard is empty, leaving nothing behind but the ringing silence and Harry, standing alone among the ruins. The war does not end with a triumphant roar, but with a long collective exhale that seems to ripple through the very stones of the castle. In the pale grey light of the morning after, the survivors begin the slow work of reclaiming the ruins. Harry stands high upon the shattered battlements of the astronomy tower, looking out over the horizon that is no longer choked by the smoke of dark magic. Below in the courtyard, Harry watches as Ron and Hermione stand together amidst the debris, finally allowing themselves a moment of shared quiet as they embrace during the first true sunrise of a world without Voldemort. Moving his gaze further along the scorched stones of the entrance, he sees Severus Snape and Minerva McGonagall standing in the shadow of the Great Hall. Snape, usually a figure of cold, predatory stillness, offers a rare, steadying embrace to the woman who led the castle's defence, providing a silent comfort as they survey the heavy price of their victory. Harry realises that Dumbledore's final test wasn't just about resisting the darkness. but about proving that a man could hold the ultimate power without being consumed by it. He chooses to keep the Elder Wand, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a silent guardian of the peace they bled for. The gnarled wood no longer feels like lead in his hand. It feels like a partner that finally knows its master. He is no longer the ghost of Privet Drive or a pawn on the board of half-truths. He is a man who finally understands the difference between a tool and the hand that wields it. A soft footstep on the stone alerts him to Lydia's arrival. She joins him at the edge of the ledge, her presence a grounding force that feels more powerful than any enchantment he has ever witnessed. She doesn't need to speak. She simply stands with him as the light catches the silver of the Thames in his memory and the green of the Highlands before his eyes. Harry reflects on the metal box he once kept beneath the floorboards, filled with the meagre earnings of a street magician and the hope for a forged real life. He realizes that the life he was saving for, one where he didn't have to be a ghost or a secret, has finally begun. He is no longer the orphan from St. Jude's or a weapon in the making. He is simply Harry, a man who has finally found a home. And that is the story of the Boy Wonder. We started this journey with a 5-year-old boy alone in a cupboard, and we end it with a man standing on the battlements of a free world. This has been an incredible project to share with you all. As I mentioned before, I'll be heading back to some of our more standard what-ifs after this, but the world of the London Underground will always be a favourite of mine. If you have enjoyed this finale, please hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the wizarding world. And let me know in the comments, was this the ending you expected for The Boy Who Lived? Thank you for riding with me through the tunnels. I'm Epic Ifs, and I'll see you in the next one.